Welcome to this webinar from Robertson Cooper. What I'm going to do in this short presentation is outline some of the key mental health and well-being issues that will be confronting people as we progressively move back into the workplace and recover from the pandemic. I want to look at this in 4 different categories. And they're shown on the left-hand side of this slide here in orange. What will be different, what the psychological issues are that arise from that, then the business issues that arise as a consequence of the psychological issues that people will bring with them to the workplace, and then briefly a mention of the solutions and the interventions that might be available to help people cope. So let's start with looking at what's different. Now, I'm not going to cover everything here, all of the things that will be different, because we're clearly going to go into what people are referring to as a new normal phase. And to a degree, some of those changes that we experience as we go through that will probably stick and stay and be permanent. Remote working, for example, is one of them. Some people have never worked remotely before, and they have done now, and they will probably want to carry on with some degree of that. Some people might be full-time remote workers when they weren't before that. There will still be movement to and from the workplace, of course, and at least for the time being, the travel issues involved there are something that will be of concern to people. There's a degree of risk in traveling on public transport. People may not want to travel to work at all. They may want to work remotely, even when to some degree it's not fully justified for them to do that. When people do enter the workplace, the organizations are going to have to put in social distancing requirements, rules, regulations. Some people might think these are too harsh and severe. Others might think they're not enough, and they don't make them safe enough in the workplace. There will be changes in people's role and the people who are in the workplace, of course, because some people may not return to work for health reasons. Some may be furloughed still. Some may be made redundant. People's roles might change. All of these ongoing changes, the flexibility and the adjustment that people will need to be making will be supported if their mental health and well-being is kept at a higher level. So the psychological issues I want to go through: mental health and well-being, psychological safety and risk, sources of pressure on people in the workplace, and resilience and emotional management. First, just looking at mental health issues. There's a lot of talk about the impact on mental health that the current crisis might have. What this diagram shows is the typical trajectories, one of 4 different trajectories that people will generally follow, based on a lot of research into people recovering from crises and disasters and major trauma of some sort or other. Those 4 trajectories break down into the one along the bottom with a dotted line, resilience. Fundamentally, what's happening there is that people are affected maybe to some degree by what's happening, but not in any serious way. And their mental health is not damaged, their well-being is not damaged, but they come through it as they were beforehand. The next line, the recovery one, reflects people who have been impacted, have been affected by what's happening, but they recover at some stage or other. The next line, the delayed response, people who seem okay at first, but then for various reasons, for example, financial pressures, they gradually get affected, their mental health gradually is damaged or suffers in some way. And then the line at the top, people who have been affected and they remain affected, and clearly those people are going to need some kind of help and support. Thing to remember about all of this and what comes out of this research into looking at people who recover from these things is that the majority of us, the majority of people, more than 70% of people, will not experience severe psychological problems in the longer run. Sure, there will be mental health issues, and some of it may be very short term, and some of it may be severe for a small number of people, but certainly not everyone. At the individual level, when people start returning to the workplace, when people start working under the new procedures, there's clearly a level of risk, and that will stimulate a level of fear amongst people. And what I want to look at now is how that information is presented and how that has an impact on people. So let's just look at the results of some research that was carried out some time ago, but it's still very, very relevant. What the researchers did was they took a couple of scenarios. This is the first one. And they actually used the example of a disease that might be fatal for some people. So in the first scenario here, the disease might kill 600 people. The first treatment option would involve 200 being saved. The second treatment option, 33% chance of saving everyone, 67% chance of saving no one. In that scenario, which option do most people select as the most desirable? Option 1, 200 people being saved. When the information is presented, it's actually exactly the same information, but it's presented differently. In the second scenario, option 1 is described as 400 people will die, and option 2 is described slightly differently as well. In this scenario, more than 70% of people choose option 2 rather than option 1. Why is that? It's all to do with how the information is presented clearly, because the options are actually identical. The reason is that people give more weight to the downside, to losses, when they're considering how to react in the face of risk. So in the first option, in the first scenario, option 1, 200 being saved, seems quite desirable. The downside is all in option 2. In the second one, the downside is all in option 1. They're the options that people choose to avoid. They're the ones that people worry about. But of course, in reality, the level of risk is exactly the same. So what this tells us is how information is presented to people, for instance, about social distancing at work, traveling to work, how to work with colleagues, etc., makes a difference to how they see the level of risk and the options they choose. Similarly, when people's emotions are triggered, fear, well-being, happiness, especially in situations where certainty and control are ambiguous, what happens when the emotion is triggered is it triggers appraisal tendencies in people. And appraisal tendencies mean how they appraise the situation in the outside world. And when you trigger fear in individuals, the appraisal tendency is one of pessimism and risk aversion. So when people are fearful, they have a more pessimistic outlook. In evolutionary terms, this makes perfect sense, of course, and they want to avoid risk. When people are more comfortable, when people are happier, when people are feeling more secure, they feel more optimistic. They look at the world in a more optimistic way. They're more prepared to take risk. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute here that what we want to do is encourage people to be unrealistically optimistic or take unnecessary risk. But we need to strike a balance in terms of the emotions that are generated and understand how people will react when those emotions are generated, in order that people can see things sensibly, respond to things sensibly in the workplace when they start to return to work. The third area, psychological safety. Psychological safety is primarily about people feeling able to provide straightforward information, to be honest and authentic about what's going on in the workplace, It's about having a no blame, safe environment. Why does that matter in the current environment? Well, think about what's happening here. We're trying to find our way through something where nobody knows the right solution. Nobody has passed through this way before, so nobody knows what's the right thing to do. We have to experiment. When we experiment and try things out, sometimes things will go wrong. When those things go wrong, what's important is finding out why they went wrong. So people need to be open and clear about what happened, voice their opinions, voice their views clearly, and then work out how to improve it, how to do it better. When people do not feel psychologically safe, if they don't feel safe in voicing their ideas, if they don't feel they can speak authentically in the workplace, then the problem solving that goes along with feeling psychologically safe won't happen effectively. And we'll stumble our way through this rather than really find an effective set of solutions. At the individual level, also, if you think about the job pressures that are on people typically in the workplace, these are no different now, the types of pressures are no different now from how they would be in a COVID-free environment. They revolve around the workload that people have, the level of demand that's placed on people, the control that people have about how to go about carrying out their work, the level of resources and communication, relationships with other people, the job conditions, and so on. Now, what's happening with COVID is that for different reasons from normal, these things are knocked out of balance. So people working remotely may feel they don't have as much control as they normally do. They may feel their workload is too high, too low. They may be losing the sense of purpose that they have in their normal work, feeling that their work is not as worthwhile, not as meaningful as it was. So all of these things will be being put out of balance because of what's happening. And the important thing is to understand what's being put out of balance and how to try and put it right. And I see that as a key role for management and leadership in an organization. Understand what's happening at the individual level with these pressures and try and do everything possible to get them into some balance so that people can cope effectively with their job pressures. There are some tools on the Robertson Cooper website, by the way, to help support with this kind of thing, as there are with some of the other things. So resilience and emotional management becomes important, obviously, in this context. People who are resilient are both psychologically healthy and behaviorally effective. So ensuring that the workforce is resilient to be able to cope with this is a key ingredient in finding a successful way through. And the one thing that's clear from the research on resilience, well, two things really. One, it has a positive impact on people's mental health. It helps protect mental health. And the second is it can be developed. Yes, some people are naturally more resilient than others, but it's quite clear that for people wherever they fall on that natural continuum, they can be helped and supported to develop their resilience. It's important that that's done in the right cultural and organizational context, but it can definitely be done. At the level of business issues, I should hope it's clear from what I've said really that the level of mental health and well-being that a workforce has is very important in terms of actually being able to cope, being able to stay behaviorally effective, being able to retain a level of performance and a level of innovation, creativity, etc., openness to working in new ways, doing things somewhat differently from before. Leadership and management clearly has a major role in that, as do the internal communications that are presented to people. They can combine to ensure that people retain the kind of energy, the focus that they need to provide the performance, the creativity, and the innovation that will help to find a way through. Just one thing about the business case for wellbeing and why wellbeing is so important. There's a lot of research that supports the importance of wellbeing in a business context, but I think this element here is particularly important. And it's about how people behave differently when their level of well-being is positive. All of these characteristics on the bullet points here represent differences between people who are high or low in terms of their psychological well-being. And people higher on psychological well-being display more of these characteristics. Better memory, more flexibility and originality, better response to unfavorable feedback. Obviously, all the things in this list are pretty much exactly what's required to enable people to assess the risk and fear, cope with the risk and fear, behave in an innovative and creative and flexible way that's going to be required in order to keep performance up at the kind of levels that every organization will want and need as we gradually work our way through the kind of things that are happening now. I've said before, the role of management and leadership here is really critical. And there's no escaping the fact that the impact that management and leaders have on individuals in every organization will be crucial. Because even when, as it says on this slide, controlling for age, health practices, and all the other factors that are mentioned there, the impact of management and leadership is still significant on individuals' mental health and well-being. So managers being equipped to ensure that they manage with well-being and performance in mind is crucial here. And they may need to do things differently. They may need to be differently equipped. They may need to learn a few techniques and approaches that are particularly important right now as we find our way through this. So finally, where are we? Well, the landscape has clearly changed. It's still changing. And some of those changes will almost certainly be permanent. That changing landscape brings about a range of psychological issues that people will bring to work with them in terms of concern about risk, the balance of job pressures, etc., all the things that I've mentioned. Tackling well-being in this kind of context makes a great deal of sense from a business point of view, and clearly it's a benefit to the individuals who are employed within that business context. Following on from this webinar, my colleague Jack Evans, the lead business psychologist at Robertson Cooper, is going to pick up where I've left off really. I've outlined some of the issues. Jack is going to talk about the kinds of interventions, solutions that can be brought to bear to help people find a way through the current issues that are arising. So I hope you found something useful in this webinar. And in the pack of material that you will be sent, there'll be a link to the next one from Jack, which, as I said, will focus much more on the kind of actions that can be taken, the things that can be done to help people find their way effectively and efficiently through the current crisis.